Some stories don't begin with applause or a dream contract. They start with an avoided gaze, a message arriving when no one wants to talk, and a gut-wrenching feeling that something is no longer yours. For me, everything began in a conference room on the 18th floor of Virex Media, where the cold white light illuminated the projection screens and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards echoed like the heartbeat of a living system. I am Jimmy Butler, a creative specialist in interactive user experiences in television and emotional media, or, as they like to call me in client meetings, the architect of the future of immersive content. 7 years of my life unfolded in that very room, from the days I was just an assistant in post-production to when I became the creative product director of PulseStream, Southeast Asia's first interactive feedback television platform. PulseStream didn't get its name by chance. It was an idea I pitched during an internal meeting when people were still debating whether users would actually want to provide real-time emotional feedback while watching TV. I remember it was a rainy day, and the lights in the meeting room flickered as though even the system was confused. I stood up and said, "If we want to keep the audience, we can't just make television. We have to create something that lives with the viewer's emotions." No one responded, but 3 days later, the name PulseStream appeared in the internal project plan. From that moment on, it became my project. I designed the experience journey, rewrote the principles of interactive feedback, and worked alongside the software team to implement algorithms that could read facial and vocal data. I believed that if I worked hard enough and long enough, the true value of my work would find its place in a world that often felt driven by politics rather than merit. Henry Falk entered the project in its second year, taking on the role of Executive Director of Strategic Program Integration. He didn't know much about coding or creativity, but he was very good at organizing busy-sounding meetings and making decisions that made others feel like they had originated them. He once told me, "You're the brain. I'm just the one steering the ship." And like a fool who believed in effort, I chose to trust him. I gave him full access to the materials, handed him the entire process of designing the experience, thinking that sharing would never harm us if we shared the same goal. But what I failed to realize was that what I built with ideas, others could take with words and titles, especially when they had the power to do so. The change didn't happen overnight. It came in the form of small details. My name began to vanish from the internal summaries. Others started introducing Henry as the father of online emotional feedback technology. I once walked into the testing room and saw him presenting the product roadmap to investors using the exact slides I had written. Even the use of emojis to illustrate viewer behavior was the same, right down to the dot. I said nothing. There are times when you should speak up, but sometimes silence is the only way to hear clearly who is stepping over you with polished shoes. I chose to observe. 3 months later, I discovered a feature that we had discarded for ethical reasons. The brainwave reading module through dialogue rhythms had been reintroduced without going through the review board. The sign-off came from Henry, under the name of a secondary project, with a cold technical note that read, "Enhanced Emotional Response Analysis for Content Optimization." My name was no longer on the development team. I was removed from the main Slack channel, excluded from key decision-making meetings. The only thing I had left was a small USB drive where I stored the original designs, the ideas that hadn't been altered, edited, or distorted for commercial purposes. The official blow came one Saturday night. I received a short email from HR, no subject, no greeting. It was just one line. "Your work account will be deactivated as of midnight tomorrow to ensure project security." No reason given, no thanks for the years of dedication. I typed a question, then deleted it. I understood. Some games are played in such a way that when you realize you're being eliminated, any justification is just an echo in a room whose door has already been locked. I stood up, removed the USB from the computer, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and walked home. It was cold that night, the air quiet enough for me to hear the sound of my shoes tapping against the sidewalk. When I got home, I didn't open my laptop, and I didn't tell anyone. I made a cup of coffee, let it cool, then sat by the window watching the streetlights blink. I thought about the 3 years I had spent almost forgetting time, forgetting my mother's birthday, forgetting to reply to texts from my ex, all because I believed that one day success would answer everything, but success never came. And at this moment, I wasn't even sure if I was alive or if I had just been pushed out of my own dream without even realizing it. A few days later, I received a message from my sister. My mother was in the hospital. The doctor said her heart was weaker than they thought. I went home, held her hand, not knowing what to say. She didn't blame me, only telling me that she never needed anything grand from me, just wanted me to know who I am and not let anyone make me forget that. I looked down at my hands, the hands that once typed lines of code, that once fixed the smallest details during sleepless nights. For the first time in years, I felt those hands trembling. As I left the hospital, I was no longer the person who had been betrayed, pushed out of my old company, and robbed of my work without ever fighting back. I was someone who had lost part of my faith in justice, standing at a crossroads with no spotlight, no place in the lineup. But it was also then that I began to think, if they can steal the product, the reputation, and the position, the one thing they cannot take is the root true ideas, true value, and the ability to start over, this time on my own terms. When I began again, there was no ringing bell or grand announcement, only a long silence between two choices: one, to forget, and the other, to rise from the very shards that had once thrown me off course. I chose the latter, not because I had a plan or strength, but because I realized I had nothing left to lose. My mother was still in the hospital at the time, her health stable, but weaker than before. She didn't ask much about work, only holding my hand and saying one thing: as long as you hold on to who you are, no one can take anything from you. Those words became the starting point for everything I did from then on, not to avenge myself, but to protect the true values I had spent part of my life chasing. I didn't return to the old world, didn't apply for another company, and didn't try to start over in the usual way. Instead, I began to observe. I joined industry forums to see what people were saying about PulseStream after its launch. Initially, there were praises, press releases, media clips with Henry in every shot. But as time went on, more and more people raised questions that mirrored the ones I had argued about late into the night with my old team. Why did the system analyze tone nuances without prior notice? Was the device storing users' emotions for commercial purposes? I read every line like a person inspecting the cracks of a mirror that had once been glued together, but still couldn't hold its shape. One June morning, I went to a small cafe in the old district, the very place I had sat writing the first PulseStream proposal. I opened my laptop, plugged in the USB, and began scrolling through the old design files, every line of code, every interaction diagram, every process flow sharpened by blood and cold coffee. It was all still there, intact and pure. I didn't write anything new in the first few weeks. I just read, watched, reflected, as though I were speaking to an older version of myself, the one who had believed that doing things right would be enough. And then, one day, I opened a new document and named it CleanCast, a new project, a fresh take on the concept of interactive television, rooted in the principles of respecting real emotions and absolute privacy. The first thing I did was call an old friend, Mai Lin, who had worked in the sound production department and left a year earlier because she couldn't bear the company's exchange of data for interaction. She agreed to meet me, bringing a hot cup of tea and a look that was half skeptical, half empathetic. I told her the whole story, leaving no detail out. She didn't say much, only asked one question. If you're starting over, where do you plan to stand? Behind the control panel or on the stage? I understood her point. I no longer wanted to stand in the back, overshadowed. I needed a stage where the good people could be seen and protected. We began rebuilding, but not a company, not a product, but a principle. I called it a media ecosystem that doesn't exploit emotions but protects them. CleanCast didn't analyze users' faces for identification purposes. It only read reaction levels to adjust content in real time, without storing data or selling behavior. It was the pure version of what I had once envisioned, but which had been tainted with dark undercurrents by others. I finished the first draft in 8 weeks, sent it to Lynn, and then to 3 people I had once trusted, but who had left Virex. None of them turned it down. They said that after years of chasing KPIs, they wanted to do something that, when they looked back, they wouldn't feel ashamed of. The problem wasn't just technical, it was trust. How could I rebuild something that had been tainted by the very hands that had once applauded it? How could the audience, the users, the investors understand that there was another way, not faster, but more truthful? I didn't have an immediate answer, but I had time, patience, and the quietness of someone who had stepped through failure without letting it kill the good parts still inside. I spent nearly 3 months calling, writing letters, meeting with each person I knew had a true interest in transparency in media technology. Some didn't answer, some refused, but some listened, and from there, a small community began to form, not the flashy tech startup type, but those who had been excluded from the old game for refusing to bow down. The greatest challenge came when I received a call from an international content regulatory organization. They said they were considering expanding their pilot program for ethical streaming platforms in Asia and needed a prototype for evaluation. I knew this wasn't just an opportunity, but a test for both CleanCast and for myself. But to qualify, I had to prove that CleanCast did not use any code from the old PulseStream model. I had to rebuild everything from scratch: the database, the algorithm structure, even the user interface. There were nights I couldn't sleep, watching lines of code run across the screen like waves, not sure if I was recreating or inadvertently copying things that once belonged to the past. Every time my hand trembled from exhaustion, I would think of my mother, of her words in the hospital, and of the cold coffee I had left on the windowsill the night I was cast out of my old company. It wasn't because I loved coffee. It was because when coffee cools, you realize how long you've been sitting there doing nothing. I wouldn't allow myself to repeat that again. One August afternoon, I received word that CleanCast had been selected for the final round of the pilot project. That meant I would have to present it before a panel of experts on media ethics, user data, and interactive technology. In the list of members, I recognized 2 names, Dr. Lynn Horvath and Dr. Aaron Volani. They were the ones who had asked questions at the PulseStream launch the year before, questions Henry could never answer. I smiled, not because I thought they would support me, but because I knew, at least this time, I wouldn't be questioned with things I wasn't prepared for. There are moments that don't require applause, don't need bold headlines, yet still mark the breaking of silence. The day I walked into the media ethics evaluation room, no one knew who I was. I was just one of 6 people presenting projects, with no affiliation to a big organization, no backing from corporations or research institutes. I walked up, holding the familiar USB that had been with me since leaving my old company. This time, it didn't contain outdated code, but the principles I had once fought to protect, principles now untarnished, no longer twisted by anyone's hands except my own. Dr. Lynn Horvath sat at the center, her gaze calm, like a flat mirror. Dr. Aaron Villani was taking notes as I began my presentation. I didn't need to give a speech. I just needed to highlight the difference. CleanCast doesn't guess emotions to guide behavior. It simply records reactions to adjust content in real time, in a way that users control. I emphasized transparency, voluntariness, and the 48-hour data deletion mechanism without explicit consent. The meeting lasted 42 minutes, not long, not particularly tense, but in those 42 minutes, I could see something clearly they knew, not about me, but about what had happened with PulseStream. In a brief question, Dr. Villani asked, "I see your solution directly contradicts the current direction of PulseStream." I nodded and replied, "Exactly, because CleanCast wasn't created to monitor. It was created to listen." After that, they didn't ask anything further. I left the room not with a sense of victory, but with a sense of movement. A current was starting to flow in the opposite direction. 2 weeks later, PulseStream appeared in a digital news report with a very simple headline, "Emotional Data Leak Virex Has Yet to Respond." I wasn't surprised. From the moment I discovered they had reactivated the forbidden emotional wave reading module, I had predicted that sooner or later someone would notice. The market isn't blind, and users won't stay silent forever. One of the former programmers I had mentored, named Lynn, quietly sent me a link. It was a security forum where a group of hackers had posted code showing that PulseStream was storing users' true emotional reactions tied to personal identifiers without disclosing it in their terms of use. The news spread fast, and within 3 days, Virex was forced to hold a private press conference with tech media. I didn't show up, didn't answer any media inquiries, but I observed. Henry made his first public appearance in more than 6 months since PulseStream's launch. It was still under the spotlight, still with that smile, but there was something no longer steady about it. In his brief statement, he said that Virex always prioritized privacy, but the way he avoided eye contact when mentioning undisclosed testing modules made everything clear. What I didn't expect was that later that afternoon, I received an email. The sender was Julia Ang. It was short and precise. As usual, "We'd like to talk, but this time, it's with you, not through anyone else." I didn't rush to reply. I needed to understand what was really going on inside Virex. In the following days, a chain of internal leaks from an anonymous Virex employee showed that the board of directors was deeply divided. One faction wanted to continue expanding PulseStream through data commercialization, while the other, led by Julia, wanted to reconsider the entire system, especially the platform's core structure. I knew that if they didn't clean it up from the root, this scandal wouldn't just stay in one article or a press conference. It would spread into a wave of boycotts. I didn't need to stand up and call for that. The truth has its own way of spreading. When enough time passes and enough people who've been hurt raise their voices together. A week later, I was invited to an industry event in Singapore, where tech and media professionals gathered to share transparent solutions. I intended to just sit and listen, but unexpectedly, just before the afternoon discussion, the organizers called me and said that a speaker had canceled and they needed a replacement. No one else but Julia had suggested my name. I stood before an audience of more than 300 people, telling the story of CleanCast, not through complicated terms, but with the true emotions of someone who had been betrayed by their old company, pushed out of the very project they had created, but chose not to confront, instead walking a different path, one longer, but steadier. When I finished my speech, no one clapped loudly, but there were nodding glances, and a message came through shortly afterward from someone on the investment board. He wrote, "If you're willing to call this a real startup, we're ready to go along." Meanwhile, on the other side, Henry was starting to lose control. Media partners began canceling contracts, citing reassessment of ethical commitments. Some of my former colleagues now working for Virex's strategic partners, said that he no longer had the right to speak in strategic meetings, and all plans to expand PulseStream into the European market were indefinitely frozen. Internal reports showed that Virex was quietly moving PulseStream's core back into an audit phase, meaning the product was essentially being dismantled, and Henry, who had once stood on stage, was now just a name avoided in emails. I didn't feel smug, but I knew this was the beginning of the end. Some mistakes don't need to be exposed by others. They will reveal themselves when there's enough light and enough time. I continued writing, continued working with my small team, building beta versions of CleanCast under an open source model so the community could contribute. But one late evening, as I was tweaking the user interface, I received another email. This time, it was from Julia herself. No longer a partnership proposal, but a direct invitation, offering me the position of senior advisor to the Ethical Technology Council she now led, a council recently restructured after Henry was indefinitely suspended. I sat there reading the words. We need someone who knows how to uphold principles, not someone who just knows how to beautify metrics. I didn't reply immediately. I closed the laptop, stepped out onto the balcony, where the city still glowed despite the late hour. I knew the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like the one who had been cast aside. I was the one now choosing whether or not to return. There are crossroads that aren't part of the plan, but when you stand before them, you know that if you don't keep going, the path behind you becomes meaningless. I read Julia's email 3 times before I responded, not because I doubted the invitation, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't replying out of a sense of victory or a desire for recognition. I needed to be clear with myself. I was returning not to fix what others had broken, but to affirm that the path I had chosen was right, necessary, and strong enough to stand independently of any system that had once discarded it. When I pressed send with a single line, I'm ready, provided I retain full control over my responsibilities, I felt no dramatic stir in my heart, but instead a quiet sense of someone who had stopped waiting for miracles and was now ready to rebuild everything from the foundation. The next morning, I received the first meeting notice with the newly formed Media Ethics Council. This time, I wasn't just presenting CleanCast. I was going to help design a universal standard for interactive technologies using emotional data. I walked into the meeting room as a builder, no longer a peripheral figure like I had been more than a year ago. Julia stood up to greet me, without ceremony, just a subtle nod that was enough for me to understand. No one was handing out opportunities this time. Everything was being built on true trust. Lynn, Horvath, and Villani were there too, their gazes more alert than before, no longer scrutinizing but waiting. They didn't need me to perform. They wanted me to help build something strong enough to prevent a repeat of PulseStream's outcome. I was assigned to lead a team tasked with reviewing the platforms of existing interactive technologies. The mission wasn't just to check the technicalities, but to evaluate the core values. Was the system transparent? Did it allow users to have control? And most importantly, did it take anything from the users without their permission? When I first held PulseStream's review document in my hands, this time from the organization's perspective, instead of being the one excluded from it, I felt something strange. It wasn't pain. It wasn't regret. It felt more like looking at a wall that once blocked me, now broken from within. Henry's technical notes were now evidence. The murky modules that once sparked controversy were circled in red, not out of malice, but because no ethical justification could support their existence. Time passed faster than I thought. In just 2 months, CleanCast was selected as the model platform to present to a group of investors and independent media organizations. I wasn't alone anymore. Lynn, my old friend, was now the head of data, 3 young engineers from a startup that had just closed due to unhealthy competition volunteered to join. And one of the most surprising things came when I received an application from a former intern at Virex, the one who had been placed on a slide with her name instead of mine during the PulseStream launch. In her letter, she wrote, "I once thought I was chosen for my abilities, but later I realized I was just the paint covering the truth. I don't want that to happen to anyone else. I brought her onto the user experience design team. There was no punishment. I knew the fault didn't lie with her, but with those who made her believe that silence was a way to move forward. We worked day and night, not to race against anyone, but to prepare carefully for a launch that didn't need to be flashy. There was no massive budget, no grand marketing campaigns, but we had something stronger content that touched real emotions and a storytelling method that didn't need to take anything from anyone to exist. The launch event took place in a small space, enough for about 70 people, but every member of the team was there, from engineers to advisors. I didn't stand on the main stage. I chose to stand beside the demo screen so that those interested could see me as a living part of the system, not just a symbol. When the demo clip reached the part where the user could click the "I don't want to share more" button, and the system immediately stopped collecting emotional signals, the room went silent. It wasn't because of surprise, but because they understood sometimes the most valuable thing is not the data you collect, but the right to not share and still be respected. In the days that followed, I received numerous partnership invitations, including one from a media company that had once been a strategic partner of Virex. They said they were looking to shift entirely to an ethical, interactive model. I didn't refuse, but I made it clear if we worked together, the core principle couldn't be compromised. We don't use users' emotions to control behavior. We only respond to make content more dynamic, not to guide anyone's actions. The real turning point came one afternoon when I was sitting alone in my newly rented small office, adjusting the first commercial version of CleanCast. The secretary brought me a letter printed on thick paper, sealed in an envelope. When I opened it, I saw it was an official invitation from the organizing committee of the Global Creative Technology Fair in Berlin. The letter said they had followed our journey, watched CleanCast from the early versions, and now they wanted to invite me as the keynote speaker for the opening session with the topic, Human-Centered Technology, When Data is Not a Weapon. I placed the letter on the desk, didn't laugh loudly, didn't jump up as people might expect in the movies. I just picked up the cold cup of coffee, took a sip, and nodded slightly, as if confirming with myself that, finally, I was ready. I knew what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew there were still many forces ready to reuse the old tricks, changing names to hide violations. But I wasn't standing alone anymore. I had a team, a community, and a principle strong enough to withstand any pushback. And most importantly, I had the calmness to step into the light, not because I needed to be seen, but because what I carried deserved to be shared. There are comebacks that don't need shouting or grand declarations, just a presence firm enough, timed perfectly, and quiet enough to make the entire room take a second look. When I stepped onto the stage at the Global Creative Technology Fair in Berlin, the white lights shone directly on my plain shirt, with no logo, no badge, no complicated slogans. I wasn't there to inspire or tell anyone they needed to change the world. I was simply telling a story, the story of someone who had been pushed out of the very product they created, who once sat alone in the dead of night with a cold USB in their jacket pocket, thinking they would never step foot in places like this again. But then, that person chose to return, not to reclaim anything, but to hold on to one simple principle. No matter how powerful technology becomes, it should never forget that users are human and their emotions are neither tools nor products. After the presentation, I left the auditorium like everyone else. No backstage access, no private photo shoots, But I knew that from that moment on, CleanCast was no longer a small project. Just 3 months after the event, we secured 4 exclusive trial agreements with independent broadcasters in Northern Europe and Southeast Asia. A chain of startups in the online education sector contacted us, asking to integrate CleanCast's emotional feedback platform into digital classrooms to help teachers track students' emotions without violating personal data. I read through every clause, edited every line of the contracts to ensure that our original principles didn't stray off track. Each signature was a commitment, not just between companies, but between people and the real values they chose to uphold. During this time, I wasn't paying much attention to what was happening on the Virex side, but one day, a news flash popped up in the Monday morning feed that made me pause for a few seconds. Virex officially cancels the PulseStream rollout in the US and Europe. CEO Henry Falk temporarily halts all activities due to internal reasons. No scandal, no sensational headlines, just a quiet withdrawal from the places once brightly lit under the spotlight. It was said that Henry had retreated to become a strategic advisor for a small advertising company in Singapore, no longer appearing in public. Those who had once worked with him gradually moved on, and some of them started reaching out to ask if there was any chance to collaborate again, this time in a more transparent environment. I didn't refuse anyone, but I didn't give anyone a role just because of the past. I learned one thing. Loyalty isn't measured by the years spent together, but by how people behave when everything begins to crumble. One day, at the end of the year, I went to our new office on the 5th floor of an old building in the creative district by the river. No big sign, no fancy glass facade, but when I walked in, I saw the team gathered around an old wooden table, their eyes focused. They were discussing a new feature where users could create their own emotional feedback modes based on personal limits. A young engineer turned to ask me, "What do you think if users can erase their entire feedback history with a single touch?" I nodded. There's no need to store everything to improve. Sometimes, clearing things out is a way to grow. And I knew I didn't need to sit at the head of the table, didn't need to be credited on every document. I just needed to know that this time, no one was being pushed out of what they had helped build. On the exact anniversary of my departure from Virex, I went back to the old building not to reclaim anything, but to submit a transparency report from CleanCast to the city's technology council. Since their headquarters were there, I entered the lobby, looking at the old company logo on the wall, now faded and placed lower than before. A young security guard asked if I needed directions. I shook my head. I remembered every hallway, every elevator button. When I left the building after completing the paperwork, I didn't feel heavy or regretful. I just felt light, like after a long rain, the sun finally coming out, not blinding, just enough to dry the shoulders that had been wet. The following month, CleanCast was officially approved as the standard platform for 2 online education councils in South Korea and Canada. When I received the news, I didn't celebrate loudly, just sent a text to my mother, who was now healthier and planting vegetables in the backyard again. She called back and simply said, "You've kept your name. That's enough." I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the days when I thought I would never be able to rise again, when I held a cold cup of coffee and stared out at a city not knowing what I was still doing here. But it turned out, sometimes silence is where the seed for something bigger is kept. I didn't return to confront anyone. I didn't need to expose anyone. I came back because I knew that if I didn't stand here, no one else would hold the line. And if there's any lesson I want to leave behind, it's probably this: no one can decide your value except you. And when you know what's right, even if others temporarily steal the stage, the spotlight, or the applause, you can always come back not asking for permission, not making noise, just with the truth. I left the final conference hall of the year on a windy December evening. No one recognized me among the crowd leaving the event. No one took photos. No one asked my name. But I knew This time, I was no longer standing on the sidelines. I had returned in the only way I knew, quietly, steadily, and bright enough for others to see without blinding them. Have you ever been betrayed? Ever been pushed out of something you poured your heart into creating? If you have, then you might understand that revenge through success is not to make others regret, but to make sure you have no regrets yourself. And if one day you face the choice to return or let go, remember, you don't need to beat anyone. Just stand firm in what you believe. Then the world will adjust the rest.